Good morning again, everyone. My name is Blerina Kotori, and I'm a partner in the Labor and Employment Group at Tonkon Torp. I'm one of today's panelists. I am joined here today by my colleague, Megan Reuther, who is another attorney in our Labor and Employment Group. Welcome to the first episode of our Coffee Break series. The series will focus on timely issues facing employers today, particularly as we grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic. This first episode will address legal considerations for reopening businesses at this time. Our hope is to provide you with practical advice for your business to thrive during this pandemic as much as possible. Now, let me pause and make a note about this format. First, please know that we are actively recording this webinar. You do not need to sign a disclosure and no private information of yours will be shared. Please know, however, that should you choose to participate in our Q&A section, which we encourage, your question may be recorded in association with your name. Feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom app. We will do our best to answer some of them as they come up. However, we want to be sure to have time for the presentation, so if we don't answer your question right away, please wait for the end, as we will conclude with a Q&A session. Because this situation is so rapidly changed, the fact is that we may not know the answer to some of your questions, or your question may be too nuanced or specific for us to address in this webinar format. In that case, we invite you to reach out to me or Megan directly, or the Tonkon Torp lawyer you normally work with. We welcome any feedback you may have after this webinar. If there are topics you want to hear about more, please tell us. We hope to be a source of information for our community throughout this challenging time. Finally, the information we're presenting here today is as of May 7, 2020, that's the day, and is not intended to be legal advice. Now, with that housekeeping information out of the way, I'll turn it over to Megan to get us started.
Thanks, Blerina. Based on what we're seeing in the news, I think we're going to be living in this COVID-19 reality for the foreseeable future. So the question is, how do we adjust to our new normal? As Blerina just mentioned, our goal today is to highlight some, if not all, of the best practices for transitioning employees back to work. That includes how to prepare for reopening the doors, how to reinstate employees, and what to do after the doors are open. At this point, the governor's stay-at-home order is still in place, but we're starting to see the gradual removing of these restrictions. For that reason, it's important to start taking these steps now. So what do you do to develop a reopening plan? Where do you start? We recommend starting with the guidance of the federal and state agencies, including Oregon's Bureau of Labor and Industries, the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Center for Disease Control, just to name a few. While these are not legal requirements, they are guidelines and best practices recommended by governmental agencies. Keep in mind that these are the same agencies that will later receive and investigate complaints about noncompliance. Therefore, one of your strongest defenses is to follow the guidelines that they put out. If you don't follow these guidelines, you should have a documented business-related reason for your decision. The guidance put out by these agencies is constantly evolving. Make sure to regularly check for updates.
So those updates and that guideline is going to be the touchstone as you create and implement your plan. The first step in that plan should be having a strategy and a timeline. The overarching theme of that strategy should be sensitivity and flexibility to employees' needs. Compassion at this stage will be just as important as it was going in, particularly if there is litigation later regarding the handling of the pandemic. With respect to a timeline, the key is to have realistic goals and manage expectations. Obviously, that first question that needs to be managed is, when will you reopen? We are already seeing a loosening of the shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders broadly at a national level. However, you need to follow local directives. That's both for a legal liability standpoint and then general compliance and safety. In Oregon, we don't think it's wise to open before the governor lifts their order. And even then, we think that it's likely that this will be handled at the county or city level. Because Tri-County is the most populous area, we expect that it will probably be relaxed last. Now, even assuming that the local ordinances allow you to reopen, that doesn't mean that employees are going to be ready to come back right away. In fact, what we're seeing right now is that many employees have reservations, fears, or particular circumstances such as childcare that don't allow them to return right away. You're going to want to open the lines of communication early about their comfort zone, ideas, and expectations so that you can build in time in your timeline to address those. Regardless, the reopening should be in stages. It should be gradual and voluntary, at least at first. We don't think it's a good idea to force employees to come in right away. Local ordinances hopefully will give us some guidance on this issue, but even if they don't, we know that it's going to be likely several months, and all efforts should go into trying to get the stage 1 right. Part of your consideration as you build that timeline is to think about which positions you'll need to return to work first. You're going to want to think of criticality and the various type of duties. Likely during the stage 1, if the position can continue to be done from home, you probably will need to continue to do that at least for parts of that stage. You're also going to want to build in timelines for a reduced schedule or hours of operation, as well as for staggered shifts, so you can limit the number of employees that will be on site right away. Other things to build in a runway for in your timeline are when to order supplies. Megan will talk about that later, but it's important to build that in, as well as when will you allow visitors, clients, third parties to come in, as well as travel. With travel, we know that at least during that stage 1, non-essential travel will probably continue to be restricted. And that probably will be a likely ordinance as well. The point is to be realistic and flexible instead of aspirational and strict in setting your goals. Then after you build this timeline, what we want to touch on right now is what procedures and protocols you'll need to follow for how you'll meet those goals logistically.
So one of the first procedures to put in place is potentially to create a COVID-19 committee or task force. It's a good place to start, and you design it by having a group of employees serve in this function. Their goal is to work together to create a comprehensive written plan or playbook to help transition employees back to work. The size of this group or committee is going to depend on your workforce. What's the needs of your company? If it's a bigger company, you may need a bigger task force. If it's a small company, perhaps just a handful of people. It should be made up by employees holding a variety of roles and with various expertise. This might include human resources, managers, maybe a few lower level employees, facility management, or information technology. In other words, the committee should look like a multidisciplinary team if possible. This group can also serve as resources for employees with questions and suggestions. Finally, make sure this committee is documenting their efforts. For example, several federal and state agencies recommend taking temperature checks. If the committee decides not to follow that guidance, not to put that procedure in place, make sure the committee is documenting why it made that decision, including listing the business justification.
Once you have taken the steps of building your timeline and you have your task force, the first question in everybody's mind is which employees are going to return first. And as a threshold issue, the answer to some of this question might be determined by the employees themselves, because even with the best plans, they might have unique situations like we talked about earlier that may not allow them to come in first. So opening those lines of communication is important. But with that aside, the first rule in which ones you select to bring back first during this first stage is to remember that anti-discrimination and retaliation laws still apply and are in full force. In addition, some counties and cities might pass ordinances that control this. We are already seeing some of this from California, for example, suggesting a reinstatement by seniority first. So keep an eye out for those. You may also have collective bargaining agreements in place or other contracts that dictate some of this. Barring any of those legal requirements, the rule should be to treat all employees the same as much as possible. One way to do it is to bring people through staggered shifts. But if you cannot do that, or local ordinances tell us that we should not do that, then you will need to make sure that you have a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for choosing which employees return to work first. Things that you can look at that are legitimate, non-discriminatory would be positions that are business critical, positions that are crucial to your revenue, any operational limitations, for example, people that need to work closely that you will not be able to maintain social distancing for. The focus should be on the function of the position and the particular skill set, not on the character traits or the unique circumstances of family, etc., of that individual. You don't want to look like you're hiring only people you like better, particularly on this first stage. Also, be very mindful not to base these decisions on your assumption and your fear of who is more likely and more susceptible to get COVID-19. We already know that some populations are more likely to get it, such as older individuals, people with underlying conditions, or pregnancy. But unless the employee themselves asks you and self-identifies as such and tells you, I'm not ready to come in, we don't think it's wise to base reinstatement decisions on those susceptibility factors. You also want to consider other risk factors. For example, were the employees on leave beforehand, and do they need to continue to remain on leave during this first stage for their own unique reasons? Do they need any reasonable accommodations under the ADA? We're going to have other webinars addressing some of these questions, but these should be built in this first stage of selecting which employees you're reinstating. And then key, you'll hear us becoming sort of broken records here, but document, document, document. It's important to show that you're using business reasons for this selection. And the bottom line is that you should make sure that the reason is defensible in business terms for these tough decisions.
As we previewed earlier, there are many logistics in addition to bringing back your workforce. The list that we provided here are not intended to be all-inclusive. It simply provides some ideas just to get you started. Really, the logistics that you're going to need to consider is going to depend on the needs and structure of your business. No matter what plans you put in place, we recommend that they're in writing and that they're given to employees before they return to the office. For example, you might want to consider what materials are going to be necessary for when employees come back. What do you need to be stocked up on before you reopen? This might include soap, disinfectant, hand sanitizer, masks, gloves, perhaps a no-touch thermometer. If you're asking employees to wear personal protective equipment as part of their job, you should provide and supply that equipment. Remember the issue of supply chain delays at this moment. We've all been to the grocery stores and we've seen empty shelves, so it shouldn't be surprised that it might take a little bit longer to get this material, so make sure you include enough lead-up time. You're also going to want to include in that potentially restocking issues. You don't want to run out of materials and have to pause your reentry of employees. Another thing to consider is a daily disinfectant protocol. This might include cleaning high-touch areas more than once a day, several times, perhaps at set times. This includes areas like doorknobs, handles, bathrooms, elevators, and kitchen areas. The first step is to decide who's going to be doing the cleaning. For example, you might have employees clean their workspace at the end of the day, especially if you're going to have a different shift using that workspace the next day. If you have common areas, you're also going to need to designate who's responsible for that. Remember that any time employees are spent cleaning or sanitizing their workspace needs to be paid. Let's not forget our wage and hour obligations. Make sure you're documenting the sanitation efforts. This might include a checklist that employees sign or initial after cleaning, and we're going to want to hold on to those records. So we have some documents of what we've done to make sure the workspace was clean and safe. Another protocol to consider is how you're going to limit contact with third parties. Inevitably, you're going to have third parties enter your work or your business at some point, whether it be customers or contractors or vendors. You will need a plan in place for how you're going to approach those interactions. For example, you might want to limit third parties to business essential visitors for a while. You might also want to limit interactions with inbound materials like mail until disinfected, or use plexiglass dividers, for example, at a reception area if needed. It's a good idea to put vendors and third parties on notice of social distancing protocols, including whether they're going to be leaving materials at the door for a while, or your requirement to stay 6 feet away from individuals such as reception at all times. You also need a plan in place for social distancing among employees. This might be a little bit more difficult because often employees enjoy going to work for the community. People may be more resistant complying with inter-office social distancing policies. However, it's important to have this plan in place before employees return and to make sure you're enforcing that plan. Your plan might include maintaining the CDC's recommended 6-foot distance. It might include staggering shifts. For example, you could divide the workforce into 3 groups and have each group in the office for a period and then the rest working remotely. Might limit the number of employees allowed in common areas. If you're doing that, think about conference rooms, bathrooms, kitchens, elevators. It might include plexiglass dividers among cubicles if the workspaces are closer than 6 feet. You might want to consider masks for in-person meetings or interactions that are required. Staggering meal and rest breaks is another idea. Think about if you have your entire workforce going to lunch at the same time going down an elevator. You might need to limit the number of people that are accessing the elevator or going into the lunchroom at one time. Before employees come back, they should electronically acknowledge and agree to abide by these social distancing protocols. They should know what they are, they should be in place, and they should sign that they've read and acknowledge it.
I agree with all that. And in fact, I would say that that acknowledgement should be not just for the social distancing protocols, but for any of the protocols and steps that we are going to be discussing here. When we're talking about protocols, what we actually mean here is an actual written procedure that you can show that you are following and that you are trying to implement. So as we're talking about this, envision an actual written policy and procedure posted in your website, in your internal website, distributed to employees in other ways, posted in your break rooms, etc. Other protocols and procedures that you need to consider. One will be for continued remote work. As we discussed earlier, we think that where possible, remote work will continue to be required at least through stage 1. The protocol for it, if you don't have one already, needs to hit things like hours and wages, performance management, workers' compensation claims, safety and security. And we're going to do a later coffee break webinar on best practices to develop that remote work protocol. Another procedure that you'll need to have in place is contact tracing. What do we mean by contact tracing? We mean that if an employee or visitor tests positive or is otherwise diagnosed presumptively as having COVID-19, you will need to trace which individuals this person has been in contact with in your workplace and then notify those individuals. All indications right now are that contact tracing will likely be mandatory for stage 1. So think ahead about how you will accomplish this. The key will be to know who is in the office every day at what time and keep a list that requires a signing in process. Some people are thinking about doing signing in electronically, and others are thinking about having a physical actual sheet. Each of them have their pros and cons. Electronically obviously might be easier for some, but others may not have the capability to do so electronically. A physical sign-in sheet does create and reinforce the idea and the need for continued vigilance and security. So you got to make the right choice for your business. If you do go with a physical sign-in, though, also give it some thought. How will you control social distancing in the sign-in line? And decide who is going to be in charge of contact tracing. We suggest HR because necessarily it will involve some collection of medical information which needs to be maintained confidential and private. Even as you notify others, you don't have to give the name of the employee or the visitor who actually has COVID-19. Along those lines, you also want to have a procedure or a protocol for employee health and taking employees' temperature. I already see there's a question on employees' temperature. The first step here is to educate employees on CDC guidance. That's the agency that will be kind of the leading agency in terms of what symptoms to look for. At this time, CDC says that the threshold for high temperature for COVID-19 is 100.4. Now, temperature taking is a unique situation because normally this is a medical exam under the ADA. However, the EEOC has issued guidelines that there is an exception for this pandemic circumstance. So the EEOC now allows employers to use temperature taking as a step. One thing to do, though, ahead of time in this process is determine whether you will do it at all, okay? There are reasons to do it and reasons not to do it. One way to do it is obviously added safety. Another reason not to do it is because, as we know, the presence of a fever does not always mean COVID-19, and the absence of a fever does not always mean that the employee is safe. So taking the temperature may create this false sense of security. The point here is that even if you do it, don't rely on it exclusively in lieu of other social distancing and other measures. If you are going to do temperature taking, and again, it may be a fine idea, we just want you to think about these issues, determine how you will do it. Is it going to be the employer, or are you going to ask the employees to take their own temperature before even coming on the premises? Another option is to consider a thermo screen. They have them at the airports now, which is this screen that captures the employee's temperature as they file through, but there is a cost that comes with that. If you decide that the employees will do it themselves, it's obviously better if they do it before they come in the office, but you should also have some thermometers handy and a private space in case their condition changes during the day. One thing to keep in mind here, though, is for non-exempt employees, it's likely that the time they spend taking their temperature at the request of the employer will be deemed as compensable time, so you might have to compensate them for that work. If you decide that you will do it, you also need to have a separate protocol for that. First thing, what kind of thermometer will you get? We recommend a no-touch thermometer, but again, supplies are limited, so if you cannot find that, and the only thermometer you can get is with contact, you want to make sure that you have enough for them to either be disposable or to be disinfected. You want to make sure that you set up a private area. You don't want to take their temperature in an open space because confidentiality concerns continue to be operative. You're going to want to have an individual who is trained to do this, to how to take the temperature and how to maintain confidentiality, how to sanitize, and how to use PPE. You also want to make sure that you make everybody subject to it and you don't have a random selection of saying, oh, you look like you might be sick today because you're pregnant. How about we take your temperature only? And then one last point on the temperature taking is don't collect or store the data. At this time, we don't see a reason for why you might need to do that. But if you do, for example, to prove later that everybody was fine, at least from a temperature standpoint, you need to maintain it strictly confidential in a separate medical file as you would for their ADA or FMLA or OFLAP paperwork. Another thing to build into your process is how you will respond if an employee refuses to test the temperature, and what is the procedure for sending the employees home if they have a temperature that's considered high by the CDC. At all times, don't forget the sick leave policies and other leave laws. And we are going to have another webinar in our coffee series to address those. You also want to make sure that you have a return to work protocol. And what we mean by this is the actual logistics of that protocol. What I recommend is that you start by envisioning what the employee's day is going to look like from the moment they leave their home to come to work, and then to the point when they leave your offices to go back home. And then visualize those steps and ask, will they need any modifications or adjustments? Okay, so starting from the moment they leave their home, the first question is, how will you handle public transit? If you have a lot of employees that rely on public transportation, you might want to come up with a backup plan because they might not feel comfortable doing so, or the local ordinances may restrict it. Once they come into the office, how will you handle sign-in as discussed above? Where will the masks and other protective equipment be placed? You need to train the employees to make sure that they know how to use the masks and the gloves, and also so that they understand that they're not medical grade, right? And don't rely on them exclusively. Once they're through the doors, you're going to want to make sure that you establish some traffic controls. for example, one-way traffic in various hallways so that people continue to maintain that 6 feet social distance. You might want to have signage and reminders to wash their hands, or 6 feet markings on the floor. We've seen some of those in grocery stores and medical offices now. Consider the physical controls, some of which Megan discussed earlier, such as screens, rearranging furniture, posting signage, sanitation stations, assigned pens and supplies so that pens are not changing hands. Establish some cultural controls too. Obviously, no handshakes and hugs. Hopefully people will remember that, but a reminder doesn't hurt. No in-person meetings unless absolutely necessary, and then a general sense of supportiveness and flexibility throughout. You might want to also increase break times at some point, at least initially, to encourage and allow enough time for proper hand washing, as well as scheduling periodic reminders for employees to do so, perhaps through emails. Make sure you're stocked on supplies. You might want to ban shared foods or drink stations and use disposable dishes. It's not sustainable, and there's issues with that, and we are aware of that issue. It's just that hopefully for this limited period of time, it will help employers contain the spread of this virus. You also want to make sure that you have a plan in case of a diagnosis or outbreak. We already talked about contact tracing, but what we're talking about now is to have a communication plan ready so that there are no delays in notifying those contacts if and when time comes. And then also to line up a backup plan in case there is an outbreak that takes out a majority of your workforce. You know, do you want to work with some temp agencies and line up some temporary work ahead of time, or what will be the backup plan for that? You're going to want to build in a period of time, obviously, and we recommend that you follow the CDC recommendations for ending isolation of employees who are diagnosed. And I think at this time it's 3 days or 72 hours since recovery, which is defined as no fever without medication and an improvement in respiratory systems or symptoms, and then at least 10 days have passed since the symptoms first appeared. Other things you might want to consider at this stage is to have a hotline or other way for employees to report these concerns and to involve them early in coming up with additional ideas. And as discussed about, to sign acknowledgement forms that they understand the work protocol. Another crucial step is going to be to make sure you train your managers and key employees in all these protocols, because they need to be the ones at the front line, and they'll be the ones that answer questions, and you need to make sure that there is consistency and proper documentation of those steps.
So after you, sorry, what, Blerina?
Sorry, I'm just turning it over to you.
Okay, I was trying to figure out how to switch the slide. So in addition to analyzing the logistics of managing your workspace and the protocols that Blerina and I have discussed above, you also have to consider how exactly, from an administrative point of view, you're going to start working to bring back your employees. One of the most overlooked but effective means of avoiding disruptions and misunderstandings is to have a plan for clear communication in place. It should be in writing as much as possible. Blerina and I have both mentioned that before, but again, we want as much documentation as possible. The idea here is to provide employees with a playbook or plan for return in advance of their return. This gives them the opportunity to ask questions or perhaps even offer suggestions. Again, empathy is going to be important here because we can already anticipate that employees are going to be feeling a high level of anxiety and fear potentially about returning to the workplace. So their ability to offer suggestions in order to make themselves feel more comfortable could be invaluable. This also brings up the point of having them review the plan ahead of time, gives them the opportunity to fill out a signed acknowledgement form. So an acknowledgement that they've read the playbook that your committee has put in place and they're agreeing to abide by the terms. So what should be in that written communication? Their expectations for when they return, so that includes all the protocols and plans that Blerina and I have been discussing. But what about their hours and schedule? You might have some atypical schedules and shifts for a while, so perhaps you have only 1/3 of the office in the office at a time. So they're going to need to know ahead of time, what are their hours going to look like? Is it going to be part-time, full-time, or is it going to be flexible and subject to change for a while? Keep in mind that employees are going to be juggling their family obligations because kids are out of school or they might have caretaking responsibilities. So giving them as much lead-up time as possible will help with this transition. Also make sure to include information about their wages or other terms of employment, just as you would with anybody who starts a job. It's especially important here if you're making changes to the wages or benefits available for returning employees.
One question that is coming up quite a bit is unemployment benefits and what happens as you reinstate them. In fact, we have some questions in our Q&A on that right now. We'll address them now and as well as later. But for purposes of this initial communication, this initial offer of reinstatement, what we recommend is that it's wise to have a statement in that offer of reinstatement letter that says, you know, we'd be happy to have you back. We look forward to having you. However, we understand you may have made other choices. If you refuse this offer of reinstatement, this may impact your eligibility for unemployment benefits, and we encourage you to be forthcoming with the state, and we need to do so too. And please know that those unemployment benefits are the decision of the state and not the company. It's important that you stick to that script because, one, it's the government that makes those decisions and not the employer. And two, you don't want to be perceived as you're coercing or trying to somehow hold an unemployment benefits right that the employee has as hostage to their decision. We'll talk about this later about what if employees refuse an offer because they might have unemployment benefits that are a little more lucrative at the moment. Another thing to address in your offer of reinstatement is PTO. This is important, particularly if you have Oregon employees, because we have a sick leave law that says that if you rehire someone within 180 to six months, then they are entitled to use their previously accrued but unused sick time immediately. So you're going to want to be mindful of that and address that in your offer. And then it really doesn't hurt to have a general reminder of at-will employment in your offer of reinstatement. What do I mean by that? What we mean by that is that we don't know how long stage 1 will last. It might be so successful that we're all fortunate and we move to stage 2 after a few months, or an outbreak might appear and then you might go back to working from home after the first week. So make sure that you lay that out for employees and you say, look, we're hoping that we can work, but we cannot make any promises and employment remains at will. And make sure that you give them enough advance notice to make this decision because a lot of them have unique circumstances, childcare, illness, etc., where they may need some time to make a contingency plan before they return to work.
So providing the offer of reinstatement should be in writing, and any response from that employee should also be in writing as much as possible. For example, if you send an email offering reinstatement and the employee calls to give you an answer, make sure you document that answer, perhaps through a follow-up email to the employee. So what happens if you have an employee who refuses to return? Your options for responding depend on the reason for why that individual refused. If an individual is expressing fear about not wanting to return, particularly due to health reasons related to COVID, that may implicate protected rights, such as under the ADA. You should, for the most part, follow your regular procedures for accommodation requests under the ADA. Examples of accommodations that may need to be considered include remote work, continued remote work, designating one-way aisles, the use of plexiglass, tables, or other barriers to ensure minimum distancing between customers or between coworkers, and generally following the CDC guidance whenever possible. Looking at other accommodations or ways to reduce chances of exposure will involve interactive process and asking employees what will make them feel safe. Our group will take a deeper dive into these ADA issues in another webinar in this coffee break series, so I'm not going to go into too much detail now. Keep in mind that if employee is refusing to return, then it's not based on a protected reason. You have the right to terminate that employment. Make sure that you follow your typical procedures, and again, make sure that you document.
Thank you, Megan. And there was a question here about if they are refusing to return to work simply because they want to make more money with unemployment, what do we do about that? I think that is their decision at that point. From what we know to date, and keep in mind, this could change in about 5 minutes after we get off this call, or it might have changed while we've been on it. But to date, we don't think that an employee's choice to collect more unemployment benefits and come back to work is a protected reason. So we think that in that situation, perhaps separation might make sense. However, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So we recommend real caution before you decide to separate an employee, particularly at this stage 1. So contact us directly because all of this depends on the unique circumstances. So keep that generality in your back pocket, but don't act just on it. So that takes us to, okay, good, we've got the protocols in place, we've made the offers of reinstatement, employees have accepted, or at least some of them have, and now you've opened the doors. How do you get ready about what happens once those doors are open? The first thing, and we cannot recommend this highly enough, is to create a safe space for employees to raise concerns with you first, instead of feeling the need to go to OSHA or BOLI or to court. You may learn something, for example, an additional safety measure that you could take that might be very simple, and it might allow you to address these questions as they come in. Another thing to be prepared for is increased accommodation requests. We're already seeing this quite a bit. COVID-19 is not only creating its own health issues, but it's also triggering underlying conditions such as mental health conditions. So be ready to handle some of those increased accommodation requests. You're going to have to follow the normal ADA interactive process. Empathy and remote work will probably continue to remain key. The bottom line is that we think if there is litigation, agencies and courts are probably going to be fairly deferential to the employees. So before you hit send on that email on an accommodation request or a request to come back to work later, picture it blown up on screen in front of a jury of 12 employees, and then think about how is this going to resonate with them, and is this an email you're going to send? And so make sure that you've got that sort of mindset on, and that you also have a process for how you're going to document and handle this increased accommodation request and protect employees' privacy. Increased leave requests will go hand in hand with increased accommodations, although not every accommodation is leave. We'll address those in future webinars as well, such as the Families First Act, sick leave, OFLA, etc. One reminder is don't forget about meal and break rules. Right before the pandemic, the Ninth Circuit issued an opinion that basically confirms the strict nature of meal and break rules in Oregon, and BOLI is the agency that enforces those. So make sure that you have those built in and you're fluent with those rules. Keep in mind wage and hour laws, overtime, etc., especially as employees continue to work remotely. And then you also might want to refresh employees on your expectations. A lot of them have been working from home for 2, 3, 4 months, who knows how much longer, right? So a refresher would not hurt. And then have a plan in place if employees are refusing to comply with the new protocols, but don't be married to that plan, right? Understand that it's a guideline for you, but you might need to modify it as things change and evolve.
So we've included some advice for you here on employee engagement. Keep in mind, we've said this before, that employees coming back, you're going to be experiencing fear and anxiety. This has been a stressful time for everyone, and employees are not immune. What we want you to take away from these tips is just that communication is key. The most important step you can take to decrease stress and anxiety is clear communication and remembering to treat employees with empathy. Some of you will offer employee assistance programs. Make sure those resources are available to employees if you have them, and that they have the contact information for whatever resources employees might need to get through this. So I'm going to turn it over to Blerina to start answering some of the questions.
Thank you. Okay, so one of the questions that came up, this is during the discussion on taking employees' temperature, and I know a lot of you are considering that, is whether an employee can do the temperature themselves, or does the employer have to take it? Okay, absolutely. The employee can take the temperature themselves. And there are benefits to having the employee administer it instead of the HR or somebody from the employer, right? Now, whether you have them do it at home or in premises, that's a separate question. You know, if you do it on the premises, keep in mind those privacy issues that we discussed, but you absolutely can have the employee do it. Another question is, well, if the employees are doing it themselves at home, you know, do they have an obligation to report it only if it hits 100.4 or higher, right? It's a really good question because, for one, what does fever tell us? It just tells us that it's there and there may be COVID-19, but if it isn't, it doesn't mean that the employee doesn't have COVID-19. Right now, I think best, most conservative, at least legally option would be to only require that they share it or report fever if it meets the CDC threshold. So I wouldn't even tell them if it's 100.4 or higher. I would just make sure that they are aware of whatever is the CDC guidance at the time, since it's changing, and say that, and have them report that for that day they measured their temperature, and according to CDC guidelines, they need to remain home. So they don't even have to tell you whether it's 99.8, 100.1, 100.3, but they can just report to you that according to the CDC guidelines that you've distributed and they're familiar with, they meet the threshold and need to stay home. I think that addresses that question. Megan, I think there's another one. I'm happy to take it, or you want to take it?
Why don't you take that next question?
Okay. So let's see here, I'm going through the Q&A. All right, so the question is, can an employee be on Families First Coronavirus Response Act and also receive unemployment benefits if they meet the qualifications for both paid leave? It's a very interesting question, right? But remember, for Families First, for an employee to be qualified for some of those leaves, is that they have to be unable to work or telework because of those specific reasons. For example, because they are ill or because they need to take childcare. Okay, that is the sort of a threshold eligibility for Families First. For unemployment benefits, usually the threshold of eligibility is that there is no work for the employee to do, right? So they're unable to work because the employer doesn't have work, because they've been furloughed, because they've been laid off, etc. So actually, they're very different standards. So I don't know this. We have no guidance on this, on how to work. But I think because the state uses a different standard for determining unemployment benefits, it doesn't seem to me that unemployment benefits will go hand in hand with Families First Act. But what I do want to caution you is that you don't make those representations to your employees. You, as the employer, are responsible for handling Families First, but you're not responsible or in charge of making the unemployment benefits. I know that some of the unemployment benefits rules have been changed during the pandemic, so the employees are able to recover or get unemployment benefits under the more relaxed standards. However, the best advice we can give to you at this time is that you just tell them that you, the employer, will be responsible for just administering Families First leave and the other leave laws, but the decisions on unemployment benefits are depending on the state.
And just as a reminder to everyone, you can submit questions. If nothing else comes in, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We'll wait another couple seconds to see if any other questions come in. Okay, well, thank you all so much. We appreciate it. And again, you have our contact information if you have any other questions. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and stay safe out there.